The meeting is being recorded, everybody. Get on your best behavior. I lost track of my tribe names. Yakima, I think that's the sixth one. And then it's the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, National Marine Fisheries Service, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife.
Josie, I think the other tribes you missed were the Siletz and the Nez Perce.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And then Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife is a TCT member as well.
Oh, okay. They've been quiet lately. Laura, can you get rid of that? Oh, it was on. Never mind. So, as you know, we're acting as the performing party for Cathedral Park right now, and so we put our own sampling plan through that same comment process. So we sent it out to the TCT at the same time that we sent it out to Marcus as well for review and comments, and everybody had 2 weeks to review it and get back to us with their concerns, questions, recommendations for improvement. And so what I'm going to go through today is some of what we heard back from those groups of folks and from Marcus. So one thing that we did find, we didn't do a great job of providing a lot of context. Our quality assurance project plan for our sampling effort was a smaller document and a more targeted document than what a performing party typically does with their pre-remedial design investigation work plan. And so we just decided to kind of manage a lot of those comments by giving general comments back to all of our reviewers to kind of explain the context a little bit better. And so that's what's on this slide. And it kind of explains how we streamlined it to really focus the resources that we have at this point to get the most data possible. So we didn't develop a really robust conceptual site model. And we want to assure everyone that this is just our initial sampling effort. We know there's going to be more sampling that needs to be done before this area can be fully designed for. So there will be some data gaps that we come away with, unfortunately, but that's standard. This is an iterative process that we're taking all throughout the harbor. The third bullet, what folks are used to seeing is a robust data gaps analysis, kind of an assessment of all the data that's in a site, and then how that plays into the data needs going forward, and then the sampling plan meets those data needs. Our areas that we're doing sampling for have pretty minimal data right now, so there wasn't a lot to work with. So we mainly put our sample points according to our remedial design guidelines and considerations, kind of what's the harbor-wide standard of practice, and applied that to the area. And also we can look at the 3D sampling results that we have already and use and between kind of applying the standard spacing of samples and then making some accommodations for existing data. That's how we came up with our locations. And then the last thing that's a little bit weird about having EPA be the performing party is that we are using our contract lab program to do our analysis. And this is a nationwide program that EPA has where they have a kind of standard contract with a number of different labs. And when we want to use those labs, we put the offer up, say, hey, this is our need to this group of people who's already pre-approved. And those labs kind of raise their hand if they want the work. And that happens in the 2 to 4 weeks before the samples come in. And so we don't know what lab our samples are going to go to yet. So there's a lot of clarification that is usually in a sampling plan about the exact lab it's going to and what their practices are that we just don't know yet. And so that doesn't happen in our sampling plan. Any questions on that?
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah.
The lab piece I've learned recently is a very important part of this whole thing, and depending upon where you send it, will generate different results. So I guess this idea gives me a little bit of panic. So you throw it out, someone picks it up and says, yes, we'll do this. Then do you vet them, or how does it work?
Yeah, so these are all pre-vetted labs. So these are labs that have already gone through EPA's certification process in order to get the work. So we know that, and they get certified for each analytical method. So we know that any sample that's picked up by a contract lab in our program we're going to get good data out of it.
Okay. Okay,
Oh,
thank you.
Yeah.
that was a great question, Laura. Thank you. Alex.
Yeah, I had a question about kind of, I guess, point number 2 on here, and you may get to more of this later on, and I know this also overlaps with some of the comments that the Yakima Nation had in their comments on the QAPP, but I guess I'd first like to get some clarification. So this is the only document that is going to exist that tells the field team how to do the sampling. Is that right?
This and the associated, there are appendices with this. Yes, it is.
Like the standard operating procedures and
Mhm.
that kind of, okay. And I mean, I think, I think everybody kind of understands the need to streamline this process, but looking through the QAPP, I'm just concerned that being the only document for reference to the field crews actually doing the work. I think the Yakima comments that Yakima Nation had a lot of comments about this, but it seems to just be lacking a lot of detail about how things need to be done. Is there any plan to kind of beef up what the field crews get?
We did. So we added a standard operating procedure for the incremental sampling as a way to kind of provide better transparency and consistency, and to meet that need for incremental sampling. I don't know, Kyle, if you want to speak to how you guys see that the existing QAPP as being meeting the need for what we're going to do.
Yeah, thanks, Josie. Like you mentioned, we do have our standard operating procedures that are currently different appendices to the QAPP, and those will all get attached to the final document that I believe will get publicly posted on EPA's website once it's been approved. And those SOPs are very detailed, pretty much for every aspect of the work, down to how to do a logbook, what notes you should take, what photos you should take, how to pack a cooler, all the different types of sample collection, how to manage investigation derived waste. Each of those are really detailed, and they go through our own quality process with our different experts in different types of sampling throughout the country, reviewing and providing input periodically. And we just went through and updated all of our SOPs last year. And so we're really confident in the procedures and how we've documented them, which I know you all didn't see in this draft, but Josie, you could provide them if you wanted to.
Yeah. No, in retrospect, I should have sent out all the SOPs as the appendices.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like, yeah, I misjudged what people would be interested in. So we could provide that as a follow-up if you'd like to see those.
Yeah, that would be good. But I know there's some aspects of it that where I think for example, I think site controls during beach sampling was one of the areas, that's the type of thing that, we're talking about having educational opportunities occurring while the sampling is going on, but it's still kind of unclear to me how that actually looks from, the scientist out in the field trying to collect a good set of data and marking everything off. I think it's that type of thing that while yes, you have some standard operating procedures for decontamination and all of that, honestly, having done some of the sampling before, some of this type of sampling before, it's just nice to see that all in a document that can get dirty, that you can refer back to. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to kind of check on that piece. So
yeah, and I definitely understand that, Alex. We don't typically do work in public parks, so this is a unique, I think, a unique experience for all of us, and we're working closely with EPA and the City of Portland to make sure we understand how we can best manage the site and do the community science. And it's just something we're still working out. It's very different when we're on a boat and working on private property and it's easier to do site controls that way. So
Yeah.
we're kind of figuring it out still for Cathedral Park because it's a new new environment for us, and I think for EPA and the city as well.
Okay, and that's why I bring it up. It's just, you know, the I think the community just wants to be able to look at the data set that comes out of this sampling and say, you know, we do have confidence that the field crew understood the standard operating procedures and all of the minutia of you know, when it's okay to put IDW into the storm sewer and all of that. So you know, I think the community just wants to know that all of that is kind of buttoned up. I'll stop talking there. Thanks.
I do think you make a good point, though. Given the kind of robustness with which we're going to do the ISM sampling, we probably can't have, like, it can't be a community event on the beach the same day that we're doing the ISM sampling, right? Because you do put out all these pin flags and create a situation that's not conducive to having a bunch of people walking around. So that's something we're going to have to figure out. I think the riverbank borings are going to be much more conducive to having people around. All right, so then we got a lot of really good, thoughtful comments from Marcus. They included both the fund lead areas and Cathedral Park. So what I've distilled here is the comments we got that were specific to Cathedral Park and to the Cathedral Park project area, and that resulted in us improving the QAPP based on that feedback. So I'll go through these again, you know, ask questions as I go at the end. One is to provide the rationale for why we're taking those incremental samples just in the top 6 inches, rather than the standard, you know, everywhere else in the site, the surface is considered the top 30 centimeters. But based on the risk assessment and where the sediments that we think people are most likely to come into contact with, we think doing the top 6 inches is the best. But we've put in an explanation of why that is, because that was lacking. We just talked about the second one, that we added the standard operating procedure specifically for the incremental sampling. And that will be further tightened up. We're going to send some folks out to actually try out some different collection methods for that sediment to make sure that when we actually go do those samplings, we've got the best tools to get the best samples out of the beach there. The concern about detection limits, I think you were started to talk about this, Laura, that the labs are really important, and knowing that they can do the analysis that's sensitive enough to give us decision data is important. So Marcus flagged that, and we talked more about that in the QAPP. The rationale, so all across the QAPP, you see that we put the samples, we space the samples at 150 feet, which probably looks pretty arbitrary to folks. It is what we're doing harbor wide, and so we added rationale to that. It's based on kind of what's done nationally, what the variable results are in the harbor itself, and what we feel like is the right balance between being able to collect a lot of samples, but also getting enough granularity that we're sure that we're really delineating our areas of active cleanup accurately. We acknowledge that challenges in sample collection may result in data gaps. We don't have a lot of contingencies in there because this is the first iteration of our field sampling. And so the result, if we don't get a sample in this first round, will be that it will be an ongoing data gap. We added in a bunch of figures that show the historic sample locations. So the original QAPP just had figures with where we were going to go do the samples for this future event. But we added in a whole set of figures that shows where the historic samples are to help better explain why we put the sample points where we did. And we've decided to run total organic carbon in all the samples rather than just a subset of them. Any questions on those? Go ahead, when I go to the next slide, Laura, and people can see what the historic sample points figure looks like. So this is just an example of showing the little red dots in there, and the white dots are the historic locations.
I'm not seeing any hands yet, but especially Marcus, did you have any questions so far?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think just this is really helpful because, a lot of the white spots end up being places where I think we had commented of gaps. Of course, I mean, the samples are older, so it's kind of can be a harder comparison, but that's really helpful, I think, at least for me to see. Um, I guess I'm just, I'm still a little bit stuck on the 6 inches at the beach. And I'm just curious, I and this is even just from a personal experience, like every time I've taken my kids somewhere, I mean, they're digging like 2 feet down, right? So I'm curious about the health risk piece of that.
Yeah, I think so. So kids do dig, right? A kid who's digging usually goes further than 6 inches, but there's a lot of just people on the beach also. There's picnickers, there's people walking, there's dogs running around and bringing dirt back. And those folks aren't typically digging down 2 feet. And so what we went back to is the risk assessment that kind of had determined that the top 6 inches was where most of the exposure was happening.
Do you expect that would be something you would go back and reevaluate at a later time, or a responsible party would go back and reevaluate at a later time?
And I think we'll be looking at the concentrations in those beach sands as part of our 5-year reviews. Is that so? We'll be reevaluating the chemical characteristics of that sand. I don't think we'll be reevaluating the 6-inch depth.
Well, maybe just to build on top of Alex's question. So, I mean, the 5-year review is kind of out there a little bit right now. But say you sampled, and I don't know if you're dividing the sample or mixing it. I think you're mixing it. So say you get some pretty high numbers in those 6-inch, will you then identify that as a gap to sample farther down? Or, how are you going to address like higher sampling levels in those beach sites?
So there's two different things. The incremental samples are getting aggregated across the entire decision unit. They're getting mixed across the entire decision unit and run as one sample through the lab. Laura, can you scroll down to the one that shows the incremental sample points? So each one of these colored blocks is going to result in one result. So this is not, the incremental sampling is showing kind of the long-term exposure. It's for looking at human health exposure. The actual delineation for looking where the contamination is better done with discrete samples. And if you want to go back up, Laura, we are doing some 3-foot coring into the beach there. And that's what, if we find contamination down 3 feet, then that would create a data gap below that we would need to go pursue. So these, like the orange circles, are where we're going to take those 3-foot hand auger samples, and then we'll analyze those in 1-foot intervals.
Got it. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
And Doug, I see.
Sorry.
No, you're good. Go for it.
The 3-foot samples, are you going to aggregate them separately from the 6-inch samples so you could have a basis of comparison between depth and surface?
So those 6-inch samples that turn into the incremental sample, they're aggregated into an incremental sample. That's one thing that we're doing on that beach. And then the other thing, these orange dots are the 3-foot hand augers, and each one is going to be analyzed discretely in 1-foot intervals.
Okay, so then that does give you a basis of comparison between surface and depth.
Mm-hmm.
So I like that. Thank you.
Uh-huh. Let's go through. I have one more slide that is the comments that we got from the TCT that also helped us improve the QAPP. So let me go through those and then we'll keep taking questions. So one of the things that DEQ has done a lot of uplands work, and so they gave us really good feedback on what might be a concern from the uplands perspective. And so based on their input, we moved some of the sample points along the Markham South Riverbank so that we made sure that the shipway was better characterized, because based on historic use, they think it's likely that that's where the contamination is going to be the highest. So we moved some sample points there. We clarified how we're doing our PCB analysis. So aerocolors is one method you can use. And the other method you can use is a congener analysis. And aerocolors is an easier analysis to run, but it doesn't get as low detection limits. So our plan is to start with aerocolor analysis. And then if that comes back as non-detect, then we'll run it with that more through a congener analysis, which will give us a lower detection limit. So that's our approach there, and we clarified that. You guys just saw this one, the figure that shows where the ISM sample increments will be pulled from. We did clarify, yeah, that's it. Thanks, Lauren. We clarified that the sediment cores will be analyzed for table 21, which is a more limited, it's just the drivers for active cleanup, whereas our riverbank and ISM samples will be analyzed for a longer list. And then we also put a placeholder in about coordinating with the city on the use of the Cathedral Park beach, because that is something that we need to start focusing on, and that is not included in the QAPP right now.
Alex, I see your hand is up, and then Marcus.
Yeah, I had a question, Josie, about the incremental sampling again, and Marcus brought this up in the RAG comments a little bit, but I was just wondering about the impact of different grain sizes on the validity of the data that comes out of that sampling. And so if you have 1 or 15 of those incremental samples for a decision unit that's got considerably larger grain sizes and maybe less organic material and than the others, is there any way to kind of correct for the impact of differential grain size in those samples across the decision unit?
Kyle's going to tell you all about it.
Yeah, I can talk about this. Thanks, Josie. So incremental sampling is a really refined approach where the short answer, Alex, is we're going to sieve and grind all the sediment, all the soil from each little dot on the map to a particular size, and then process it in a way, it's called the 2D slab cake, where essentially you make like a sheet pan of uniformly ground soil, and you subsample from there in a precise standardized way for each lab analysis. And so that's how we control for grain size in these ISM samples. And the main purpose is to get the best, most representative, unbiased average for a particular area. And that it is quite a bit different from typical sampling, like the sediment coring, where you don't go through this like sieving and grinding step. But the purpose of that for ISM is to develop an average concentration over an area and a number of aliquots, a number of subsamples that you take, the 50 points per box.
Okay, I'll have to think about that a little bit
Yeah.
more. Well, I'm just wondering. So you're sieving it and you're grinding it. So you're first taking out a particular range of grain sizes, and then you're actually grinding it after you do that.
Yeah. Sorry. You are. So like when we're at the beach itself, we'll be just using our hands, removing like large rocks and gravel and stuff. And then what we collect will be then sent to our lab in Denver to sieve to less than 2 millimeters, which is like a really coarse sand, a really large grain of sand. And then after that sieving step is when we actually grind the material into a much smaller particle size, like on the range of a silt or a clay. And that's to equally represent the different grain sizes that are smaller than a gravel, essentially.
Okay. I mean, I guess I still don't understand how if you've got one of the 50 subsamples that you're taking that is primarily 1-inch rocks, and then another sample from somewhere else in the same decision unit that's primarily fine grain sediment. I'm still struggling to figure out how you standardize those based on just the surface area of the material itself.
Yeah, I understand that and ISM, in areas that are like, if there's a sub area that's just like a bunch of big boulders, we would most likely adjust our decision unit, since the large boulders or rocks or all large gravel doesn't have the same sort of risk pathway as smaller materials do, like the sand and silt and clay. So we are in the field trying to make sure we get representative samples over an area where exposure could occur. We're not going to go to an area with a bunch of like big riprap, for example, and try and do ISM sampling there. So
Yeah.
there's a little bit of field judgment involved to make sure that our decision units make sense. They've been set up in a way that that captures the potential exposure area as a whole. And we do plan to go out for a field recon and possibly tweak the boundaries of these boxes if needed beforehand. But the idea is you want your decision unit to represent an exposure area or an area that's generally similar in like the soil content and grain size. There's going to be some differences, of course, but the reason we do the sieving and the grinding is to make everything equal. So a bit of field judgment, a lot of lab processing, and really strict following really strict procedures to generate an unbiased result. The ITRC, the Interstate, blanking on the acronym, Technology Resource Council, something like that. They have a really great in-depth guidance on ISM sampling that they just updated last year. If you want to get in the weeds on, I could send Laura that link if she wanted to pass it around. It's really weedy, really in the weeds.
I'm familiar with their guidance.
Okay.
It's
what I read when I was trying to figure out this increment.
Yeah. So presumably any data that came back that looked like it like because of any data that came back that had some uncertainty attached to it, that would be addressed in the reporting, I would assume then.
Yeah, and two of the decision units, the two that community informed us are the most high use areas, we're going to be running those in triplicate. So each dot, we're going to collect 3 little scoops of soil that are going to be in separate bags and processed and run as separate samples. And so for those two, we'll get 3 result values that we can compare against each other and use as a benchmark for how good we did, essentially.
Okay, thanks. That actually gets to another question I had that I won't have to ask now, was that triplicate sampling. So that's only going to be happening on 2 of the decision units?
Right, the dark blue one and the cyan.
Okay.
And that's one, we've heard from folks who do this more often than we do even, that really we just need to do it on 1. But we're going to try to do it on 2 just to be extra sure.
Okay. All right, I'm going to let other people talk now.
Those are great questions. Marcus, you're up next, and then Laura, I see your hand too.
Yeah, this just goes back to the coordination with the city on like site use. I know with the RAG, we had provided some additional comments in the appendix around like different activities that could be done. And I know, Laura, you and I talked a little bit about like how do you gather additional like user information. I'm wondering if you have or are going to share those recommendations with the city as well, then if you're involving them.
Oh yeah, we definitely can. Jessica Terlikowski is on. I don't know if you know her, Marcus, from other work, but Jessica, just so you know, Marcus in the reg submitted an appendix A that has what he's mentioning. So Jessica and I check in every 2 weeks. So I'll bring that up in our next check-in.
Great. Yeah, I think the use piece is kind of that really important piece that's hard to get at.
Laura, you're up next. You still, oh, you're muted for now, but
Yeah,
oh, God.
I have been reading PCB sampling docs, well, 1 or 2 on the Duwamish, and they found volatilized PCBs in sort of a sink above the river, I think they called it. I was looking for the name of the testing model they used, and of course I can't find it. And I wondered if RO-chlor samples the air as well.
We're not doing any air sampling as part of this effort. Kyle, do you know if you wanted to test for PCBs in the air, whether you do an air core sample or does it matter?
Congeners would be the better analysis if you're doing surface water or air. And the main reason is that PCBs like to stick to soil and sediment, and to measure them in water and air is harder. And so you would want the method with the lower detection limits to give you more meaningful results. And so the surface water samples, for example, at Portland Harbor that were taken a couple of years ago, those were all the congener analysis to get those better data.
And did they get PCBs? Did they pick up their PCBs?
The surface water samples did detect PCBs at quite low concentrations in the like picograms per liter, which I think the analogy I've heard described is like it's less than a needle in a haystack, essentially. But that was surface water and not air samples, and so I understand the concern that it is different. And EPA has looked into this a bit for the River Mile 11 East project area, but I'm not sure if it's gone any further than that at this point.
Thank you. I would like to know about that River Mile East investigation. I always feel that EPA poo-poos this, but I think I learned at the Northwest Toxic Summit that as we start actual remediation, stuff will be stirred up and brought into the air. And I'll just keep bringing it up until someone.
Yeah. No, I know there's been some discussions, Laura, about and I don't know what the status. I need to talk to Hunter about it because I can't remember. Like there have been discussions, and I don't know if it's actually been decided yet. But I was going that direction because we've heard that community concern, and we know it's really important. And there was discussion that during River Mile 11 East, like their remedial action work, they would be taking some air samples in the beginning of that work, and would be testing for PCBs to see that, and that would be a good. They're probably going to be going first in the remedial action efforts too, because of where they're located and how far ahead they are too. So, but I'll follow up with that. But that's right now. I think that's going to be really important, to address your concern. So I'll follow up with Hunter on that piece.
Okay, thank you.
Laura, I know that's come up a number of times before, and we've talked about that, and just in discussions. I mean, I think the important takeaway that I have from that, from all those discussions, is that the community is worried about essentially breathing in the volatilized PCBs, and I think we at some point there was talk about how do you actually sample that, but honestly, I think just an ambient air sample from the vicinity would go a long way towards easing community concerns about that. So just wanted to throw that.
Thank you. Thanks, Alex. Any other questions? Or we have about 4 more minutes. We could take probably one more question, and then we just have a couple wrap up things for the next time. This is all really good. I don't see any hands right now.
If
Marcus,
nobody else has one,
Oh.
anything else? I did
Yeah.
have one more thing. I noticed that in the QAPP, it talks about IDW, I'm sorry, investigation derived waste into the sanitary sewer. And I'm just wondering if the BES and City of Portland has been involved in those discussions about when it is okay to put IDW down the sanitary sewer.
Kyle.
So we have updated the investigation derived waste sections in response to comments from the TCT and RAG, and generally we're going to be drumming and disposing of everything. I think the exception is when we don't have like non-aqueous phase liquid, like visibly impacted material. We use a biodegradable detergent, a non-phosphate biodegradable detergent that is safe for discharge to sanitary sewers. And so our wash water, essentially, when we're doing like the final rinse of cleaned equipment with that detergent and then deionized water, that's what would go into the sanitary sewer, for example.
But wouldn't that still need to be tested for all their MS4 permit or whatever?
I believe so. The sanitary sewer would go to the
Oh, you're
the
right. I see. Yeah.
yeah, the treatment works, and it's essentially, very similar to if you're washing your dishes and the soapy water goes down the drain.
Okay. I still thought municipalities would have some requirements for investigation derived waste going down sanitary sewer.
Yeah, and maybe we're getting hung up on terminology. So like all of the sediment, all the excess sediment, for example, that is going to go into drums as waste and would be appropriately analyzed and disposed of following EPA and the state of Oregon's requirements. And then for fluids, for water, those are going to be containerized separately. And also analyzed and disposed of appropriately. It would just be kind of like that final wash water, and deionized water rinse that isn't required to be handled as investigation derived waste. So we did take that input, and for example, rather than returning soil on the riverbank from where it was collected, we're going to put it in drums and dispose of it properly.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'll take a look at the revised language.
I see, Doug, you have your hand up. We have only about a minute left, so it
This
is
is
okay.
basically a yes or no answer. Out of curiosity, has Portland Parks and Recs been involved with the process at all to date?
Well, I will say Kyle DeHart has come to a couple of these meetings, and he is with Portland Parks and Rec. But Josie, did you want to say anything? And then Jessica Trilakowski, if you want to say anything too. Josie, you first.
Yes, that's all.
Okay.
So at least they're aware you're working on their beach.
Jessica, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I can say so. Doug, as you know, so like the city's Portland Harbor program is like the program for the entire city, right? So we're coordinated with any other bureaus who are involved in any of these efforts, and we coordinate regularly and are in regular communication with parks too.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. Okay, so in the last minute, thank you all so much for your time. Again, I can't thank you enough for being